Hello all. My name is Jeffrey Katz. I'm the president of the Washington Map Society, and I'm very pleased to welcome everybody to today's program, which is hosted by a partnership of 8 map societies representing all parts of the U.S. Boston, California, Chicago, New York, Rocky Mountain, Texas, and Washington Map Societies, as well as the Library of Congress's Philip Lee Phillips Society. All of these societies are nonprofit organizations and support map collecting, cartography, and the study of cartographic history. All of us also supply financial support for this Zoom meeting. If you are not already a member, we hope you will consider joining at least one map society. You will see posted in the chat feature of this Zoom links to each of the map societies' websites. The benefits vary for each society. For example, members of the Washington Map Society receive 3 annual issues of the Portalon Journal, digital access to all past issues of the Portalon, digital access to past speaker lectures, and many other features in the members-only section of the website. If you are not a member, the WMS has an introductory rate of $25 for the first year of membership. Now, before we proceed with our program, I want to be sure to thank our partner map societies and our advertisers who support our groups and help make possible the publication of our journals, the Portalon and the Calafia, the Journal of the California Map Society. I also have a couple of requests for this Zoom presentation. First, note that this lecture is being recorded. So please turn off your video and microphone if you do not want to be recorded. Second, please use the chat feature to type questions, and they will be addressed at the conclusion of the talk. And after the Q&A period, we will leave the meeting open for attendees to socialize if they wish, at which point, of course, you may turn on your microphones. And now let me turn the program over to Ron Grimm, who is the WMS Vice President and Program Chair. Ron?
Thank you, Jeff. In consultation with the other map societies, we have developed a schedule of monthly Zoom meetings through June of 2022. This schedule has been published in the current issue of the Portalon, and I have circulated this information to the chairs of the other map societies. And we will be sending out publicity monthly for each of these the upcoming meetings. Our next meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, March 8th, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. This one is organized with the assistance of the Chicago and the Rocky Mountain Map Societies, and it will feature Asa Simon Mittman, who is professor of art and art history at California State University in Chico. The title of his presentation is Seeing Across the World: How Medieval Map Makers Brought Their Monsters Home. His talk will focus on the Hereford map, which is the largest and most detailed map to survive from medieval Europe. He will explore the visual strategies that medieval map makers used to create the sense that a viewer safely ensconced in a church in England could see distant peoples throughout the world. I will now turn the program over to Naomi Heiser, the program chair of the Rocky Mountain Map Society, who helped arrange tonight's presentation. She will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thanks, Ron. It's my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker, Barbara Belye. She taught at the University of Calgary for 30 years, but now lives in the small Rocky Mountain town of Canmore, Alberta. Her research focuses on geographical topics based on North American fur trade archives. Books in this field that she has written are Columbia Journals, A Year Inland, Dark Storm Moving West, and Peter Fidler, From York Factory to the Rocky Mountains. Tonight's presentation is entitled Papering the Landscape, Maps of Regime Change in North America. If you have questions, you may type them in at the chat feature during the lecture, and they will be answered at the end. Barbara will address a few of your questions at the conclusion, and we will now turn the program over to Barbara. Thank you.
Evening, everybody. I'm honored and happy to be asked to speak with you about a part of the world that doesn't get much attention, even though it's a fascinating region with a long history. And I'd like to thank Naomi, Ron, and John for arranging the talk. I look forward to chatting with you at the end of it. Now I'm going to.
Barbara, maybe you could be just a little closer to the screen.
How's that? Is that good?
Yeah, I think that's better. Thank you.
Okay. Now I'm going to screen share, and this will take a minute to load the slides.
Probably also speak up.
This takes a long minute because there's. There we go. Now, if you can full screen your screens, you'll be able to see better the details of the map. Okay. First, the title. This project has evolved. I think regime change sounds a bit hard and political. It's really about cultural shifts. I hope to show by looking at 3 regions and 3 moments in history how cartography was used to confirm political takeovers and cultural change. In each instance, new maps were drawn to confirm new regimes. These maps have been praised ever since as technical advances over previous maps, or even more dramatically, it's the first maps of regions hitherto unexplored. The idea for the project is simple.
Okay, Barbara, some people are having trouble hearing.
They're
So,
having trouble hearing, and I'm having trouble advancing the slides.
okay. Okay, we'll be patient.
Well, I'm not sure how to do this. I'm doing what I've done all along. I mean, I can do it this way, but it's going to take longer. All right, this is the idea. If you can imagine a map, each map is one of the file folders. If I lay the first map on the ground, and then I lay other pieces of paper with maps on them on top of these maps, then you get a stack of maps from the earliest at the bottom to the latest at the top. And these are the maps that we'll be looking at tonight in their chronological order. Now, a few comments on the analogy. The top map hides the earlier maps and it seems to replace them. But of course, we can look under and see that there were other maps. New map is not necessarily an advance or an improvement on the earlier ones, but it's different from them. It's made in order to appropriate and reshape the landscape it depicts. Each map in the stack reimagines the region it depicts. Sometimes the maps reflect each other. Sometimes they claim to be the first map drawn of that territory or an advance in cartographic method and technique. My project is divided into 3 sections. First is called The Mapping the Settled Parts of Canada, which is about the British takeover of New France in 1760. The second one is called The Mountains Only a Line. This will be very familiar to you. It's about mapping the Upper Missouri and Lower Columbia rivers in 1814. The third one is the one we'll look at tonight, North to an Unknown Country. Now, we locate some places in Canada. First of all, Hudson Bay is pretty obvious. And then I want to isolate what the explorer I'm talking about, J.D. called his study area. And if you go from Lake Superior and you go up the, in a northwest line, you go Lake Superior, Lake Winnipeg, and then right on the provincial border, there's Reindeer Lake, which is connected to Wollaston Lake, and Lake Athabasca, which is on the next provincial border. And then up in the Northwest Territories, you have Great Slave Lake and Great Bear Lake. Now, another way to locate the Reindeer Lake to Lake Athabasca arc of lakes is to go to the Big Bend of the Missouri, which you can see down here. I must not use the mouse because you can't see it. Big Bend of the Missouri, then cross the border, go north, cross the border, and then go up the provincial boundary to Reindeer Lake and then over to Athabasca. Soon after it was formed in 1867, the Dominion of Canada acquired vast territories from the Hudson's Bay Company that stretched north and west of the former colonies. For centuries, the fur trade had balanced specific interests between European and Indigenous populations. Now Canadian surveyors pursued new aims in these territories. Within a few years, the Western Plains were sectioned by township and range, and their first inhabitants hustled onto reserves. The north was explored for useful minerals, as well as eventual transport routes and sites of hydroelectric power. While the plains were soon transformed, northern development was slower. The landscape itself was the obstacle. Half of Canada's landmass is bedrock of the Canadian Shield, lying like a huge collar around Hudson Bay, extending west to Great Slave and Great Bear Lakes, east to, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to turn off the phone. East to the shores of Labrador. Two-thirds of the shield is covered with boreal forest, which then yields to tundra in Nunavut, Nunavut, and north of the Great Slave Lake. The surface contour of the shield is low. Most of the terrain consists of plateau ridges drained by innumerable lakes and streams. Native groups lived in this harsh environment by hunting and gathering, and some still live this way. They moved along its complex waterways with a sureness that amazed newcomers. Even so, French, British, and Canadians who ventured there refused to recognize Indigenous knowledge as a claim to the country. Instead, the newcomers saw their own presence as possession and mapped it for themselves. Canadian surveyors coasted Hudson Bay as soon as the territories were annexed. Among the earliest was Robert Bell of the Geological Survey of Canada, who tested a possible shipping route from Churchill to ports in Britain and presented this plan to the Royal Geographical Society. This in spite of the fact that Hudson Bay is open for shipping 4 months of the year. One of his party touring Hudson Bay was James William Tyrrell of the Dominion Land Survey, a man of strictly imperial convictions who was drawn to the north as a great mysterious region of terra incognita, with but few exceptions untrodden by the foot of man, save that of the dusky savage. Sorry, I'm not clicking these properly. There's J.W. Tyrrell, and now we have J.B. Tyrrell, Joseph Burr Tyrrell, J.W.'s brother. He was to become the best known representative of the Canadian Geological Survey by leading 3 northern expeditions and publishing accounts of his travels in the Royal Geographical Society Journal. J.B. was less unbending than his brother, and for that reason, much more interesting. He was a generous man, open to new ways of thinking. He had moments of doubt and insight before he settled again into the orthodox mold. We can follow him during these moments and glimpse the interface between the GSC's expertise and traditional ways of knowing that were still
Start
vital
video. Click.
in the
Light
country.
comes on up there. And there you are.
Now, this portrait shows JB as a millionaire. He was young once before looking so prosperous. Between 1892 and 1894, the GSC sent J.B. Tyrrell on several exploratory trips north of the Churchill River. Tyrrell was in his early 30s, fit, intelligent, knowledgeable, and adventurous. Already he had discovered coal deposits and dinosaur bones east of the Rocky Mountains. The life of a geologist was not what Tyrrell had been trained for. He had studied law before joining the GSC for an open-air life to improve his health. He was lucky to work for an agency that valued learning on the job and creative initiatives. This would never happen today. He would have to go back to university. On assignment in the Klondike, he decided to prospect for himself, turned to gold mining at the Kirkland Lake, and made a fortune as an entrepreneur. In later life, he published records of northern explorers, Hearn, Thompson, Turner, and Fidler, commenting on their journeys by recollecting his own. The success of Tyrrell's northern expeditions came from his readiness for new experiences and his ability to capitalize on local opportunities, never more so than when he drew on the cartographic knowledge of his native guides. Now we can have a look at Tyrrell's northern expeditions and how they were organized. This was the ultimate goal. This is the tundra, the Dubont River, and it stretched to the north and allowed Tyrrell to go to Chesterfield Inlet, which was long known as a goal in the search for the Northwest Passage. Tyrrell wanted to link with that kind of exploration. But his first northern exploration that we're looking at tonight is in quite different country. It's treed mostly with this black spruce and filled with lakes and rivers. The expeditions were organized from Hudson Bay Company posts, which Tyrrell called the last traces of civilization before he headed off into the wilderness. And this was the wilderness that he headed into, this spruce forest, the stunted trees, and lots of bog, and zillions of bugs. Here are his cedar canoes negotiating a portage. And here are the rapids on the Fond du Lac River as it's coming down into Lake Athabasca. We'll go over this route over and over again in just a minute. And finally, here's a Chippewa camp at the east end of Lake Athabasca. Tyrrell's first northern assignment was to investigate this area that you can see in the map. The Churchill River is along the bottom of the map, and on the right you can see the Reindeer River going up to Reindeer Lake. Actually, the river goes down to the Churchill River, but we're going up to Reindeer Lake. And then there's the connection to Wollaston Lake, Black Lake up there with the big red slash near the top, and Lake Athabasca. Now, Tyrrell was determined to go into country that had not been previously mapped, that he knew of. And so he chose to go to Cree Lake, which is right in the center of this map, and going up the rivers to Cree Lake, and then continuing on to Black Lake by the red slash. Then when he returned up the Fond du Lac River to Lake Wollaston, and then he came down that final route west of Reindeer Lake down to the Churchill River. So we'll see this map again and follow his route. Obviously, a summer expedition to this area would have to be selective and to consist of lines of travel rather than extensive coverage. Tyrrell had chosen his study area because it was remote from all ordinary routes. No reports or descriptions of it had been published, and the greater proportion of it has never been traveled over by white men, not even by the officers of the Hudson's Bay Company. Tyrrell may have consulted this recent map issued by the Surveyor General of Canada and looked with satisfaction at the inscription in this space. You can see Reindeer Lake, Lake Athabasca, they're a bit deformed here, and the large title in capital letters, unexplored. At best, his statement that most of his study area remained unexplored was disingenuous. The route from Reindeer River to Fond du Lac and Lake Athabasca were well traveled by Chippewan hunters and had been carefully surveyed by white men, even Hudson Bay Company traders. Tyrrell was aware of fur trade surveys by Philip Turner in 1791 and by David Thompson in 1796. This is this map is in really poor condition, but if you look hard, you can see that same pattern of rivers and lakes. Tyrrell also consulted the notes of A.S. Cochrane, a former colleague who had explored the eastern edge of the study area only 12 years before. Pasted into the back of his expedition notebook were copies of Thompson's map and Cochrane's map of the route to Lake Athabasca through Reindeer, Wollaston, and Black Lakes. At the same time, Tyrrell refused to credit these explorations because Turner, Thompson, and Cochrane had not published their surveys. Just to be sure he was covering new ground, Tyrrell nevertheless looked at the blank space he found to the west of the Reindeer Lake route. This is where he would lead his own expedition. Tyrrell was also familiar with published narratives of exploration. He could look north and east from his unexplored area to the Arctic coast discovered by Samuel Hearne, Sir Alexander Newton, Sir John Franklin, and George Back, all well-known fur trade explorers praised by Sir Clements Markham, the president of the Royal Geographical Society. Their achievements, insisted Markham, entailed details of heroism such as have never been surpassed and seldom equaled in the whole history of discovery. George Back, the last of these famous men, returned to England in 1835. Since then, the continental north had remained, this is according to Markham, had remained completely unknown, and it was felt that something should be done to fill up the large area of blank on the map. On the 14th of July, 1892, Tyrrell stood poised at the edge of unknown northern territory, ready to play his own heroic part. Tyrrell had arrived at Cree Lake, which you see in the center of this map. It was latitude 57 degrees, 19 minutes, 30 seconds north. I enjoyed the rapture, he wrote, of being the first civilized man to look down into the clear depths of this large lake and to gaze into the distance over its shining waters. The rapture had little to do with how clear or large Cree Lake was, everything to do with its status as unknown to Canadians or anyone else in the world except local Chippewas. Tyrrell had crossed the most important line in the north, the limit of his own culture's terrestrial knowledge. For him, Cree Lake was until this moment a frontier of the known universe. He was there to fill up the large area of blank on the map, the universal map, the only real map, drawn according to European conventions. A good start was to observe for latitude, estimate the altitude, and take the temperature of the water using 3 of the party's measuring instruments, a sextant, a barometer. As for the lake's size, Tyrrell couldn't see the far shore of it and resorted to native sketches to estimate its surface area. The next memorable moment of the expedition occurred 2 weeks later as Tyrrell crossed Black Lake with his 2 Chippewan canoemen, Ithingo and Drew. One or both of these men may have drawn the sketches which Tyrrell deduced the size of Cree Lake. As they paddled along the shore of Black Lake, Ithingo paused and pointed to a river falling north. And this is what they saw. This is the Chipman River. Tyrrell named it when he saw it. Ithingo remarked that a route to hunt caribou led up a chain of rivers and lakes to a height of land. From there, a large river flowed farther north to Chesterfield Inlet through a country of Eskimos and muskoxen. Listening to the Chippewan man, J.B. Tyrrell was electrified. If he followed Ithingo's track north from Black Lake, he would push through unknown territory to the Arctic regions visited by Markham's famed explorers. Tyrrell lost no time in asking his canoeman for a sketch of the route. Ithingo's map, drawn in pencil on two sheets, you have only one of them, but it's on 2 sheets of GSC letterhead, is now in the Thomas Fisher Library at the University of Toronto. As he had for Thompson's and Cochrane's manuscripts, Tyrrell made a copy of it, which is more visible, and took the copy with him when he returned to Black Lake the next year. In 1893, he and his brother J.W. followed the map all the way to Chesterfield Inlet and traveled a parallel route in 1894. These trips and a subsequent crossing from Great Slave Lake were the Barren Lands expeditions that made the Tyrrell brothers famous at the time and ever since. While Tyrrell and his assistant were occupied in charting the route and noting rock formations, the canoeman ferried them along lakes and rapids, carrying supplies over portages, made camp, and cooked the meals. The geologists performed little, if any, manual labor. The expedition was a research safari. Tyrrell justified the division of labor. Nothing must be allowed to interfere with the primary object for the trip. The canoeman's job was to allow the leaders to perform their scientific tasks. Expedition supplies included a long list of precision instruments, and this is one of them which I find particularly intriguing. This is a Massey patent floating boat log. And all of these were designed to map the terrain and measure its features. These instruments and their use distinguished the geologists from the men who worked for them. Ithingo and other Chippewas who guided Tyrrell and drew maps for him used no instruments at all. When they volunteered knowledge of other routes and when they were asked to draw maps, the Chippewas produced sketches that ranged from alternate paths to coverage of huge regions. Maps like Ithingo's were tailored to specific requests and selected from a fund of geographical observations that the cartographer had assembled over a lifetime from memories and hearsay. Conventions of these native maps were common to inhabitants of the Canadian Shield, and arguably their form was a response to Shield terrain. Since the landscape did not allow features such as lakes and rivers to be known visually from some vantage point, they had to be memorized as sequences, learned by traveling from one feature to the next and retaining the order in which one came upon them. I'd like to underline the relationship between terrain and the kind of map that Ithingo was drawing, because maps with the characteristics I'm describing can be seen as functional responses to the challenges of travel in this landscape. So I've got some stills here from an excellent series of videos about canoeing in the area of Reindeer Lake. This is actually crossing a bay of Reindeer Lake. You see that there's no horizon. There's the horizon of the water, but you can't see the following, the opposite shore. Small lakes, and all you see is the enclosure, and you're not quite sure how to get out of the small enclosed lake. But you do find a way. There's a little stream, often, in fact, usually with rapids, and you line your canoe or you portage it from one lake to the other. To know where you are going, you need to have a topo map in front of you, or you have to keep the sequence of lakes and rivers firmly in mind. And the reason for this is you don't really see anything. You don't see ahead. You see the empty horizon of the water on the big lakes, or you see that enclosure of the spruce forest on the little lakes. And you have to really search for the portages and go through them. So it helps to know in your mind the general direction that you want to take. Repeated experience is the best way to learn the sequence. When Tyrrell remarked that a certain place was so many miles distant in a direct line, Ithingo retorted that our route was much longer than that. And if I, that is Tyrrell, knew how far it was without traveling over the country, why did I take the trouble to come and make a survey of the river? For Ithingo, a map, whether kept in the mind or drawn on a page, was the transcript of his experience of traveling the route. Reporting the conversation, Tyrrell, of course, had the last word. Explanations were futile. Neither understood the other's idea or method of mapping, though the sketch itself could serve as an object of translation. Ithingo's map exemplifies three consistent characteristics of native cartography. First, it was made without a thought that the page size might dictate a scale of drawn features. He sketched his line of lakes and rivers to the edge of the page, and then because he needed more space, he used a second sheet of paper to continue the sequence and mark the last features he remembered. In other words, he didn't limit his map to the page, but added a page to complete his design. His map was independent of the surface on which it was drawn. The page didn't represent the surface of the earth measured by the stars as it would have for a European map. A second characteristic is that a specific route, such as the way to the caribou grounds, was drawn without context. An inclusion of other features would be confusing and suggest blind alleys, so additional features were pared away. And a third characteristic of native maps is their direction. The starting point of Ithingo's map was at the bottom of the page. You see it on the left sheet there. It's Black Lake. And beyond that, to the farthest point he had heard about. You can fit these two sheets together. You can see the repeated forms. So it actually forms one very long map. The geographic far points were drawn farther up the pages, thus farther away from the person who was holding and reading the map. So if I have the map and I'm holding it this way, I've got my starting point closest to my body and my farthest point farthest away. If the map is drawn on the ground, as most historians insist that they were, you stand at one end and you look ahead to the other. Unlike European maps with their cardinal directions and grid of parallels and meridians, the logic of Ithingo's map was body logic. To follow the map, Tyrrell had only to locate himself along the line of connected features. Tyrrell made use of Ithingo's map when he returned to Black Lake the following year. We might even say he relied on it to find his way north to Chesterfield Inlet. But the romantic idea of exploration so seductively promoted by Sir Clements Markham had had a year to work its magic again. Describing his 1893 trip in the Journal of the Royal Geographical Society, Tyrrell played down the map's importance as if its usefulness were insufficient. Here at Black Lake, we were to leave all beaten paths, he declared, and to strike into the unknown wilderness without other guide than the little Indian map obtained the year before. His brother J.W. Tyrrell, who went with him on the second northern trip, discounted the map entirely. We obtained some information from the Chippewan Indians, but even these native tribes were found to have only the vaguest idea about the character of the country that lay beyond a few days' journey inland from Black Lake. Ithingo's map was played down because, as they repeatedly declared, the Tyrrell brothers wanted to think they were venturing into unknown country. Terra incognita was terra nullius, open to claims of possession. At the same time, to defend their scientific pretensions, the brothers also had to play down the work of fur trade cartographers. The fur traders must be seen as inadequate, not scientific enough, even though they were white men, civilized men who produced European-style maps. But the brothers went too far when they claimed that their own work was better science than the traders. Even though they used sophisticated equipment to chart their routes, the Tyrrell's notation is evidence of a running survey very like the surveys of the fur traders. J.B. was aware that traders were acquainted with the route from Reindeer River to Fond du Lac. Thompson had traveled the route. Tyrrell had access to Thompson's journals, had read Thompson's summary narrative, had studied Thompson's great map of the Northwest. He knew little about Turner and nothing at all about Peter Fidler, who had been Turner's assistant for the Hudson's Bay Company's first northern venture. In 1791, the two men reached the east end of Lake Athabasca, went a short distance up the Fond du Lac River, observed for both latitude and longitude, and marked their farthest point. In 1796, Thompson's goal was the marker that signaled the limit of the company's earlier survey. In 1807, Fidler retraced Thompson's route. For his Reindeer Lake, Lake Athabasca trip, Thompson kept a minimal journal in which hunting for food quickly became the dominant topic. As he returned up the Fond du Lac River, Thompson's canoe overturned. Only his cork-lined sextant box, in which a map draft lay folded, was fished from the rapids. Now, what I want to show you here, and it's not going to work, was running the rapids where Thompson's canoe overturned. And it would have been an exciting excursion, especially in the COVID times, but it's not going to work. The surviving pages of Thompson's journal refer repeatedly to this draft, as well as to other rough maps which had been saved. Thompson later used the draft to draw the features of his route on his map of the Northwest, noting as well a passage of the Chippewas to the Mosslands from Black Lake. Thompson's general map, the journal fragment, and his latter-day account of the journey are all the evidence we have of his exploration. Although his other journals differ from this one in that they contain meticulous records of his running surveys, Thompson's usual practice is to keep his rough maps separate from the journals, and they too have disappeared. Thompson's draft map in 1796 might have resembled the charts ruled with a Mercator grid of latitudes and longitudes that Hearne carried to the Coppermine River in 1701 and 2. Thompson's rough maps may have been like the field maps that later surveyors drew in their notebooks. I mean, this is all total speculation. Here's Robert Bell's field books, and you can see that on the map, little map on the top flap of the left-hand side, there are little directions. West, it's north, south is at the top, west, north, and east. And so what Bell is doing is establishing that little page of his notebook as the grid, the world grid, on which this tiny bit of the earth is mapped. J.W. Tyrrell does the same thing in his notebooks. You see on the top flap of the notebooks on both sides, in pencil, are his notes as he's taking his survey. On the left, you have the bearings, the compass bearings. Then you have the number of paces that are gone in that direction, and any notes on the landscape features that they're passing. And then he maps that section of the route on the bottom page of the opening. And you can see the little N at the top, which is indicating that that's the north. So this is the Chipman River up from Black Lake. And all of it carefully measured. You see that the scale is 1,000 paces to 1 inch. So it's very classic mapping techniques that we're familiar with, and not at all what Fingal was doing. In 1807, Fidler went north with David Thompson's abstract of The Way We Are Going. This abstract, which may have been a summary of the journal and may have included some of the rough maps, has also disappeared. Given Thompson's accident, the abstract can't have been much more detailed than the fragmentary evidence we have. In contrast to Thompson's, Fidler's own journal furnishes not only a detailed narration of events and description of the country, it also notes all the courses and distances of his survey and includes on-site sketches of the route. And these are some pages taken from his journal of going down the Fond du Lac River. It's possible to plot his courses and directions to have a good idea of the landscape he passed through, and thus to draw a map from the information contained in the journal. So I just did this little experiment. I took those directions and distances that he indicates in his journal. And I mapped that section of the river. And you can see in A.S. Cochrane's map that characteristic zigzag in the river. The drawings of Fidler's journal presented landscape shapes with no regard for cardinal directions. Like native maps, they consisted of linked sequences that relied for their form on connections rather than geographic positions. Like native cartography, the little maps presented the view from the canoe, the essential view for traveling the country. And at the same time, all of these indications of the courses and distances are given so that the little sketch maps in Fidler's journal are combinations of European and native cartography. Fidler's deep and abiding interest in native cartography, his journals record dozens of native drawings, explains in part the form of his own sketches. After traveling the length of the Churchill River in 1807 and sending 2 maps to the region to London in 1808, those European style maps, Fidler wintered beside Reindeer Lake and collected sketches from 4 Chippewan trading partners. Their maps recorded a knowledge of the continental interior that more than matched Fidler's own. The Chippewan maps are remarkable for showing vast regions beyond the fur trade routes. Chiho drew the east shore of Reindeer Lake and a route to Hudson Bay. So there at the top is Reindeer Lake. And you can see often down at the bottom there, the route from Reindeer Lake to Lake Athabasca and going off with the route to Hudson Bay. Thoredale drew not 1 but 2 roads from the Fond du Lac River to Hudson Bay. You can see that dotted road that goes, the 2 dotted lines are the roads to Hudson Bay, leading from Lake Wollaston and from Little Hatchet Lake. He also drew routes from points upstream and downstream of Black Lake towards the northern caribou grounds. So if you locate Black Lake on the left, and then you see the lines which extend out. Now what's interesting here is that the routes to Hudson Bay go across the map from left to right, and the routes to the north go across the map from left to right. But we know, don't we, that the routes to Hudson Bay go east and the routes to the north go north. There's no change of direction here. But think of it, you're going along in a line from Deer Lake, Reindeer Lake to Athabasca. You're taking that path. And then somebody says, well, why don't we go to Hudson Bay? So you turn right and you go along in that new direction. You get to Black Lake and somebody says, oh, instead of going along straight to Lake Athabasca, let's go up here. And so you turn right. And so it makes sense to go along. That's your major line of travel. And these are lines of travel that branch off from them. So the map has its own logic. Agina, who had accompanied Hearn and whom Fidler had met twice along his route in 1807, showed a track from Wollaston Lake to Hudson Bay and a route from Lake Athabasca to the Arctic coast. These hunters had traveled, or knew others who had traveled, to the farthest point reached by Markham's explorers. Now, another interesting thing to note on this page, there's Agina's map on the lower half of the page, but on the upper half of the page is a map drawn by John Charles and copied by Fidler. John Charles was a fur trader, and there were dozens of fur traders who mapped in this same way. And so Fidler is not a one-off. He's not an exception to everybody else of his period. He's actually representative of a bigger movement in the fur trade circles of adapting themselves to this cartography that's like the native cartography, although not quite. Fidler's conversation with Chippewan hunters after his own exploration of the region, after mapping his own survey results, indicates that he valued the Chippewan maps beyond their use as a provisional route finding aids. Fidler was more than usually sensitive to Chippewan culture. As a young man, he had spent 2 winters with Chippewan families and could communicate reasonably well in the language. He was also familiar with cartographic conventions of his informants. What is evident is Fidler's acceptance of this culture, so different from his own, his respect for the hunter's extensive acquaintance with the country, hundreds of kilometers north, northeast, and east of the route from Churchill to Lake Athabasca. Since the 17th century, Royal Society science had distinguished between useful knowledge and local knowledge. Science produced useful knowledge. Scientific principles were universal, scientific methods were generally applicable, and applied science would improve conditions of life everywhere. Local knowledge was limited, circumscribed, providing less certain ways to understand nature and serve mankind. The Chippewan maps might be categorized as local knowledge, except that the geographical awareness they indicated was far-reaching, and the apparent simplicity of their designs was not due to ignorance. Thanks to Fidler's interest in these native maps, they've been preserved for us as a kind of antidote to Tyrrell's progressive thinking. The Chippewan's knowledge was more than local. The fur trader's topographic expertise was at least equal to Tyrrell's own. Fur trade knowledge was lost on Tyrrell as he covered the area of his first northern expedition, lost in the Fond du Lac River when Thompson's canoe overturned, lost in company archives, lost because Tyrrell wanted to believe he was the first civilized man to explore the areas. The traders themselves coordinated each other's explorational activities, aware that they surveyed according to the same method, careful to survey with the greatest possible precision. Both Thompson and Fidler traveled north from Reindeer River to join up their surveys with Turner's. The goal of their long trek through the wilderness was improbably enough one single stripped tree left as a mark of Turner's farthest point in 1791. And you can see lopped tree marked near the A of the little map at the top there. Thompson reached the tree in 1796 and observed for latitude 59 degrees, 16 minutes, 22 seconds north, within a few seconds of Turner's and Fidler's earlier reading. This tree was also Fidler's goal in 1807. By then, it had fallen down and squirrels and woodpeckers had built their nests in it. Fidler made a new marker. It too must have fallen down 85 years later when Tyrrell passed by. Heading south again to the Churchill River via a route unexplored by the fur traders and unknown to his canoemen, Tyrrell was more vulnerable than he imagined. Ithingo and Heddery had not previously traveled this route, nor could Tyrrell's own survey and observations rescue them. They turned in circles, lost and hungry. Hunting scarce ducks for food did not make the situation easier. At last, Heddery recognized a place he had visited the year before, so he could link this place with others in a network of familiar paths. He at once recalled to mind the geography of the surrounding country, said Tyrrell joyously. Uncertainty as to our route was now at an end. We hailed with delight the finding of a route which we could follow with the assurance of finally reaching our desired destination. When uncertainty was at an end, when he no longer faced the unknown, Tyrrell again recorded his emotion. This time he felt not rapture, but intense relief. Once more, at his desk in Ottawa, Tyrrell's old certainties returned. He didn't reflect on the failure of his own route finding skills or how the Chippewas made sense of the Shield's lake-strewn maze. Too much was at stake. Careful preparations for his expedition, the varnished cedar canoes, the copied maps, the precision instruments, drop points arranged for supplies and shipments, were meant to ensure against accident or loss, including loss of direction. Tyrrell's travels north of Cree Lake, going beyond the last traces of civilization, were a test of faith in his own way of knowing. He couldn't risk losing control. GSC expeditions were supposed to be all about control, steady advance, territorial possession, exploitation of new resources. Tyrrell had explored an area of 40,000 square miles and was preparing to go farther north. His expeditions into the Barren Lands, like other GSC surveys and his brother's trip east from Great Slave Lake, were conceived, carried out, reported, and mapped, exactly like his first northern trip in 1892. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Barbara. I think you've showed us maps that most of us have not seen before or thought about. Just maybe a simple question. How much of this area have you visited? And how accessible is it today?
I've been to the edge of the boreal forest in several places. I've never been to this area. So I'm just in your position. We're all armchair mappers, and as far as this area is concerned. Accessible, it's very accessible by air. You can take a flight there any day of the week. And that's what has made this area, that's a major form of transport up there is air travel.
I think the process you've shown us probably makes us question the word discovery and the word exploration as not being one single event, but being a process.
Yeah, it's a process of recognition. You recognize a landscape as different from anything you've seen before. But you also recognize the knowledge of others. And that's where these conversations with the canoe men and the guides, the Europeans, the British, the Canadians, the Americans who made the greatest progress, if you could call it that, were the ones who were the most open to these, to having conversations with people with different kinds of knowledge than their own.
Okay, one question from the chat. Much has been written lately about the suppression of native cultures because of the move to take over native lands. Does this have any application to your mapping information?
It shows that a landscape which hadn't changed for thousands of years, I mean, archaeologically that's proven, for thousands of years, has suddenly changed in the blink of an eye, relatively speaking, in the last 100. That beautiful Chipman River that I showed you now has a hydroelectric dam on it. The Fort McMurray oil sands are just down the road at the other end of Lake Athabasca. I mean, there are big changes in this area. The native reserves have been set up apart in this part of Canada, but that's not true for all of Canada. And so there's ongoing litigation about native reserves and also the right to resources. You know, you can sit on the patch of ground that was allocated to you when everybody else moved in, but you don't have mineral rights. And that's one of the problems in gaining some kind of economic independence, is to have the right to exploit the resources on the reserve lands.
Okay, a question from Dan Winester. To where did they report their geology and hydrologic observations?
I'm not quite sure of the exact ministry that they reported to, but ultimately the Geological Survey of Canada was reported to the Government of Canada. It was a government agency.
Okay, Noreen McSee says, how were the native maps preserved? Are there many others?
They're preserved mainly in copies. That's why I say Fidler is noteworthy not only for his own travels and his own record of them, but also for recording, copying these sketches, and copying them, I would argue, fairly accurately. If you compare Fidler's copying of a native drawing with, say, William Clark's, William Clark will make the rivers wavy. He'll sort of adapt the design. Fidler doesn't. He uses those straight lines. He doesn't try and make it look like a European map. And there's a set of maps that were drawn for Fidler at Chesterfield House of the Missouri River. And in Fidler's rough journal, there are pencil lines under the ink lines that Fidler left in his journal. And it is quite possible that the pencil lines were drawn by the chiefs themselves when they were talking about this area. And so the maps in Fidler's journals were actually drawn by the informants that were telling him about this river system. The other maps in Fidler's journals are just copies, and there are here and there in various archives native maps preserved, and as you added them all up, they'd come to a few hundred, but it was haphazard, and it was usually through conversations with some explorer or missionary or trader that they are survived today.
Okay, Stephen Nagler asks, how far north did the Chippewayan people's detailed knowledge of the land extend?
Well, it depends which ones you question, and the ones that were questioned by Tyrrell during this expedition, the farthest north that Ithingo had ever heard was Dubont Lake, which is about 800 miles north of Black Lake, which is a fair distance. Agina had been to the coast. He'd been with her. He'd gone down the Coppermine River. I don't know of any. And then, of course, there were the maps that were drawn much, much earlier in 1869. The maps that sparked Herndon's visit to the Coppermine River in the first place. And they were maps of the Arctic coast from Hudson Bay to the Coppermine River. And so the knowledge was right up to the Arctic coast.
Okay, Terry Gordon asks, was the area you described under the nominal dominion of the Hudson Bay Company, was this their territory, even if their actual possession was nominal because of its isolation?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, because it was a little bit blurry, the transmission.
Okay, was the area you described under the nominal dominion of the Hudson Bay Company, was this their territory, even if their actual possession was nominal because of its isolation?
The Hudson Bay Company didn't possess the territory. Yeah, the Hudson Bay Company was a commercial enterprise. It was a monopoly. It was a chartered company based in London, and it had, if you like, the exclusive franchise of the Northwest Territories that were eventually annexed by Canada. So I wouldn't call it possession, but I would call it occupation. And until the last decades of their hold on this area, and particularly on the west coast of what's now Canada, it was mostly a network of trade relationships. That's what they were there for, and that's what it remained. And because their trade relationships were in furs, they wanted the country to stay the way it was. They weren't terribly keen on developing it, because then there would be fewer fur-bearing animals. But there were mining and lumber operations on the west coast before they gave over their occupational rights to the Canadian government.
Okay, I think that is it for the questions. I would like to thank you on behalf of the Washington Map Societies and the other map societies. And so I have a few gifts for you, which when I get your address, I'll send them to you. First of all, there is a cut line map of Calgary. So I know you're not living in Calgary now, but it's probably the closest place I could find. And then to remind you that you talked to the Washington Map Society, here are a set of note cards with a pictorial artistic map of DC on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. So at this point, if you want to unmute yourselves and just chat with each other a bit, that would be fine.
Can we say a thank you to our speaker and a thank you to the organizers of this wonderful program?
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a terrific presentation.
And thank you for hosting all of our societies from here in Chicago. Let me speak on behalf of them.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I see numerous people clapping.
Thank you for bringing us into uncharted territory, which we knew nothing about.
Right, right. They're like, who knew those people, the Chippewas, know how to draw maps? You know, come on.
I'm curious about the maps. They seem to be all together focused on itineraries, and they weren't sort of maps of say beaver concentrations or something like that. A lot of the early published maps in the 18th century had a lot to do with beaver behavior. And I wonder if you had any inklings of what might have been scribbled in company archives or something about, you wouldn't call it treasure troves of beaver belts or something like that, but well-known territories that were wanted to be exploited because of the fur trade.
Well, there are various kinds of native maps. Like these ones are obviously route maps.
Right.
But there are other ones that go way back to the 17th century, which are territorial maps.
I see.
Saying these are our resources, this is where we've always lived, and establishing their right area.
That's what I wondered, whether there weren't even quasi-political maps in the sense of saying, this is our group and that's their group, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think they're mostly, there are some from New England, there's some from the Spanish southwest of the state, but I don't know very much about those. You know, I know they exist, but that's about all.
Barbara, you mentioned pencil line underneath ink, and you said it was possibly the Indian drawings. Can you explain? Can you explain that again, please?
Let's imagine the situation. It's early February, 1801, 1802, and Fidler is welcoming various Siksika chiefs into his trading post. And he says, and oh, by the way, can you tell me about the Mississippi River? And they say, sure, I can show you what it's like. And often in these conversations, when they're reported as dialogues, it's the native person who is talking with the non-native person. It's the native person who proposes the map. It's not the non-native who says, could you draw me a map? It's the native who says, well, I can show you by drawing.
Mhm.
So let's imagine that happens. And Fidler is in his office and he's got his journal spread out in front of him. And paper is limited. And so he hands the man a pencil and draws in the book. That's a possibility. I mean, it's no more than a possibility.
So you're saying these maps were very small in his journals as opposed to on a large sheet of paper?
Well, they were in his journal. They were about, they're bigger than an 8.5 by 11. They're usually 11 by 15 inches. That's the size of the journal.
Right, it's just normal sheet.
That
Okay.
would be
One other possibility could be that when people were copying maps, either enlarging or reducing them, they were using a pentagraph. And if they used a pentagraph, they had a pencil in it. And they would trace over the original and the copy would be drawn in pencil, which they could then later ink for a more permanent representation. So that's another possibility of why there's pencil underneath ink.
then you're putting the original at another remove. I don't understand why we can't entertain the idea that one of these chiefs actually drew a map on a piece of paper that we still have.
Oh, I agree. I'm just saying if he made a copy, because he didn't want to destroy the original, and he wanted to copy with him somewhere, he would have done it.
Why would he?
And that would have produced ink on top of a pencil.
Why would he need to do that? Yeah, what's the point?
To
It was
preserve,
his journal. He had his journal. He didn't need to reproduce it for anybody.
Well, he did. He
No.
actually he copied his journal and he copied the maps into another journal book. He also copied one of the maps and sent it to London. So those were Fidler's copies of the maps that I would still maintain originally were drawn in his journal.
Thank you. And thanks for doing the talk, by the way.
Mark Warhus, who wrote Another America, has an explanation for this scene when Fidler is interviewing the Siksika chiefs. And he says, this is February, remember, it's cold outside. And he says, they went outside and the Siksika chief drew a map in the snow.
You know, Barbara, I have a good friend in Calgary who spent a lot of time in the territories. And so your remarks have been very important for me because I've been, interested in his adventures after retiring from a CPA firm. I've been to Calgary.
Good.
I enjoyed it. I went, of course, I was, of course, up there for the Stampede.
Well, you've done better than I have because I've never been to the Stampede.
You're kidding. How could you not go to a Stampede?
I just never got there.
The chuck wagon races, the drama, the excitement. They,
I'm
in
gonna say-
Calgary,
As a
In
native
Calgary-
Calgarian, it was often a good time to leave town. All those people
But-
coming in.
well, you know, when they had the embargo on livestock from Canada down to the United States, the rodeo people in the US were distraught because all the really good competitive jumping horses and cattle and all those people are owned by the Stampede up in Calgary. And if you didn't have a really good competitive animal, you got a really terrible score. People don't understand how important Calgary is to the US.
So I'll confess, I did go to the Stampede sometimes, and it was fun. I have a question for Barbara, though. Did the native peoples make their own portable copies of these maps ever in some fashion, or was it all just remembered after being shown once or twice?
Good question.
There are a couple of birch, Ed Dahl knows more about this than I do, I think. There are a couple of copies of maps drawn on birch bark that were left. You know, you draw a map, I have gone here, and you'd leave it for
Okay, just one head. 5 hands left.
I'm sorry,
What?